Hi, I'm Jen.
And I'm Claire, and we're senior psychotherapists from the Cheshire and Merseyside Resilience Hub.
Today we're going to talk to you about the trauma brain. You'll see things on screen that we're going to talk through. So I'm just going to start to talk a little bit about the different parts of the brain. Our brain has lots of different parts, there's lots of different things that our brain does, but we're going to talk about it with respect to trauma. So the first bit is the thalamus, or we like to call it the cook. That's where all of the ingredients from the environment initially come into our brain. So like the sounds, the sights, the touch, the smell, all of those parts go into that cock where it kind of stirs up all of those ingredients together in our brain. The amygdala is the next point in the brain, and that's, we liken it to like a smoke detector. So its job is to make sense of all of these ingredients from the thalamus that come through. It's the emotion centre of the brain, so its job is to then respond. Mm-hmm. The other part is the hippocampus, which we'll call the librarian, and its job is to put away memories, to store them, the when, the where, the how, to put them into categories and into order in our brain. And then the other part is the prefrontal cortex, which is the watchtower, as we'll call it. So that's the thinking bit of our brain. That's where our logic, our reasoning and our executive functioning sit. And that's where we make sense of all of this information that comes through.
I think it's helpful to think about processing memory and processing distress if we refer back to how our brain processes a non-distressing, or what we would call a normal situation, a normal memory. So when we're experiencing something quite kind of non-threatening, I'm going to think about being on the beach eating an ice cream. Our brain processes memory using those 4 elements. So if we're in that situation, our thalamus gets on board and starts to look at what we call the ingredients. So it'll be thinking about the sounds we can hear, the smells, the touch sensations, taste, and it'll be sending that information through to our amygdala. And as you said, the job of the amygdala is to scan all of those ingredients for any level of threat and to think about if it needs to respond to that threat. So hopefully for most of us, eating an ice cream on a beach is non-threatening. So our amygdala will scan those bits of information and recognise them to be non-threatening and allow that information to go through to the next bit of our brain, which is the hippocampus. And as you said, the job of the hippocampus is to store memory, but it also looks at times like it may have been in that situation before. Our brain loves to pattern match. It loves to match information with things we've previously experienced. So the hippocampus, in terms of eating an ice cream, will look at all the times that we might have been in that situation and bring those memories forward. That will then go up to the prefrontal cortex, our newest level of thinking here, and it'll, as you said, put all that information together, and it'll almost make an assumption to allow us to act. It'll say that you're eating an ice cream on a beach and this is the action you need to take. That all obviously happens within a nanosecond. So when we're in a non-threatening situation, our memory network works quite well and succinctly together. Would it be helpful for you to explain a distressing situation and how that works?
Okay, so when we think about, I'll bring in a kind of example of a spider. So if we think about a distressing or disturbing memory, so if we were to think about a spider, and some of those ingredients that the cook would gather together would be the feelings that we might have, what's happening in the surroundings that we're in, what we can see, what we can hear, all of those ingredients of the environment. That would get sent to our amygdala, our smoke detector, and our smoke detector would go off. It's danger, there's a threat here. And its job then would to set off our fight or flight response, which is our fight, flight, freeze or appease. We do go into that a little bit more detail in another workshop, but essentially that's our body's way then of responding to this danger. If our amygdala, our smoke detector set off, the whole of our brain's job is to focus on the danger or threat, because that's the most important thing. Its job is for survival. It sits at the back of our head, the emotion centre in our brain, and it's safety first, ask questions later. So what that happens is that those steps forward in terms of the librarian and also the watchtower, they kind of get shut off when that amygdala is turned on, because the whole of our brain is focused on that danger and threat. So our library system doesn't get a look in, and our watchtower doesn't get a look in. What can happen is after the distress has passed and as our emotions reduce, those bits of our brain come back online. So then our library system finds it really difficult to put those memories away, because it's different to the ice cream memory. It's bigger, there's distress, I felt really overwhelmed and really needed to leave. So the library system struggles just to categorise it. It stays out on the library table. And then our thinking centre, which is at the front of our brain, our rationale, our logic, then that often has a lot to say about what happened. So why did you run? Why did you do this? It wasn't a spider, or it looked like a spider, it's not the same situation. And actually it has a lot to say, and it's usually very critical.
Yeah.
It often makes us feel worse because it's very negative, the should-ofs, the would-ofs, the could-ofs. But we often liken it to kind of having a best friend at a party. They've got a lot to say for themselves, but they weren't there. They weren't present, but they have a lot to say for themselves. And that can actually make us feel worse. You also mentioned about pattern matching. So what our amygdala does is our amygdala doesn't respond, our smoke detector, just when we see the spider, but when the environment is similar enough. So if it was to happen here, our brain would go, purple chairs, that was danger last time. This situation of sitting and talking, that's when something happened. So our brain is really alert and aware to danger, because its job is safety first, ask questions later.
Okay. So if our brain's constantly pattern matching, it means the thalamus is ingredients, what it's gathering in every situation we're in, is constantly being evaluated by the amygdala. It's looking for threat, scanning for threat all the time.
Yeah, it's hyper alert to keep us safe, because that's its job. And also if you do look at the slide, we can see that we've got the cook, all those ingredients coming in first. That message reaches our amygdala first, it reaches our smoke detector first. And if you think about train stops in our brain, that's the first stop. So it's a quicker route, and actually it needs to be a quicker route for survival. It needs to reach that point first for us to respond. That's often where we might find that we jump or we run away before we've had a chance to think about what we're responding to, what are we jumping away from. And that again is for survival. It's better that the quicker route is to our smoke detector to respond to danger, rather than go into the slower route to the front of our brain when we might go, what's that noise and what's that thing, and by which point it's too dangerous for survival.
Is it fair as well to say that people who may have had a trauma experience in the past, we sometimes say that their amygdala is a little bit more sensitive, they respond and interpret situations in a bit more of an emotional way and predict threat and distress, when actually the logical brain would understand that there isn't any there?
Absolutely, because the logical brain at the front might know we're here now, we're not in that moment. But when our amygdala is the smoke detector set off, it's got all of that emotion from that original event. It's too big, and our emotions are ruining the show, essentially.
Yeah. Okay. So what do we know what we do about it? I think when we think as therapists, what we're helping people to understand first of all is how to soothe that amygdala, how to prevent it from responding incorrectly and being hypersensitive to stressors. That tends to be a big part of the work we do.
Yeah, so that's a big part, because if we're feeling distressed in the now, often it's about how do we soothe that amygdala, that smoke detector, saying we're okay, we're here, it's safe, this is where I am. The other part is that thinking bit at the front, that we might know when we've left the room, oh, I'm okay, oh, I'm safe. But also, it's hard for us to access that when our emotions are too big. So we might know that I'm here in the now and I'm safe, but actually, as we've said, if our emotions are ruling the roost, it's hard for us to think in those moments. So a big part of therapy is about how do we bring ourselves back to the present? How do we bring ourselves back into our body? How do we soothe that amygdala? Because when our amygdala is soothed and the emotion's not as big, the rest of our brain can come back online.
So then when, I was just thinking about the prefrontal cortex, the watchtower, and that critical voice, sometimes is it right that that critical voice can activate the amygdala all over again if we're hearing that internal dialogue of us not doing something correctly? That's quite stressful, isn't it? Quite anxiety provoking.
Absolutely, and if we're having those thoughts, there's going to be emotion attached to that, so that's going to get our amygdala fired up. Also, some of those thoughts can be, watch out, how we're going to manage, we can't cope, and often with trauma, because our brain is really hypersensitive to the environment, we're always checking out what's happening to work, we're super alert, our amygdala's already ready to go, essentially.
So if one job of a therapist and some therapy experience is to learn to soothe it, would the other job be, if you have had a trauma experience, would be to help the brain to put that memory away properly, to not have it out on the library table, as you said earlier, and to make it more difficult for the amygdala to assume that we're in that threat situation, we're in the past, rather than here in the present.
Absolutely, because when that's getting fired up, it's with all of those emotions left out on the library table, and ideally we want it to be filed away. We want to be able to access it when we choose to, and not when it chooses to. When we have all these ingredients come in, those memories on the library table get nudged, but we often might not want them to, or we might not be aware of what's happening in our environment. And that can feel really scary because our body's responding and we're not quite sure what the threat is, but our body's feeling under threat, and that can feel really scary.
I always think as well with people about if that difficult memory has eventually been put away and processed, it forms one of many memories, so it's into perspective. If it's left on the library table, it feels really raw and there's nothing to compare it to, so it feels like it stands alone and so feels more likely to happen.
Yeah.
There's 37 videos in total looking at different elements of thoughts, feelings, behaviours and physical responses to distress and discomfort. I hope you find some help from them.